Welcome, everybody, to the Contextual Christian Church Bible Study, where today we will be getting into 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 31, to 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 7. And everybody go ahead and bow your heads as I pray as in. Father, thank you for this time that you've given us to be able to read your word, and for every second that's not promised. I pray that what we read today can be relevant to what we've been dealing with, but I pray there be some positivity in it and that it shows us where we can go, not just where we are or where we've been, positive and negative. In your son's holy and precious name, Jesus Christ Yeshua. Amen. Now go ahead and pause 1 second as I switch it over to the first section. All right, and we'll be getting into 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 31 to 35. I'll give everybody a second to get there. Oh, I almost completely forgot. I apologize, everybody. I didn't do the summary from last time. So, as towards what we read last time, I can't believe I almost forgot that. As towards what we read last time, we started in verse 16 and went through 30. And we read where Josiah, we basically went into all the things that Josiah was doing. How he literally was taking care of everything, slaughtering the high priest of these false churches, taking care of everything in the ways that God had asked and required of us from the Old Testament, though we are in the New Testament. He was allowing no falseness to be there. That was pretty much the whole situation. Getting rid of the false things and bringing in the real. That which was following God according to what God had required, as we talked about what was written in the book. And then we ended in verse 28 with what was written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah and what had happened into that situation. How God, during the time when Josiah, first off, before we got to bringing up that part of the book, how he didn't turn away the fierceness of his wrath or his anger that was kindled against Judah, or because of everything that was done through the king Manasseh and all the evil that was taking place, including things like not just false idolatry, but also even killing their children by burning them as sacrifices to their false gods. It was crazy how far it went. And so we ended up going through, we see in verse 30, where both 29 and 30, where Pharaoh Necho, which the Pharaoh is the king of Egypt, so Necho went against the king of Syria all the way through to the point of the river Euphrates. And Josiah went against him and killed him at Megiddo. So we had one last detail that wanted to go out of its way to point out. Now, we don't know why it went out of its way to point out what happened with the king of Egypt, that Pharaoh, and why he died in Megiddo and was brought back in a chariot to his people. But we do know this, that it went out of his way to go ahead and point that out. And now, as we're going to get into today's first reading, 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 31 to 35. And Jehoahaz, his son, let me say this first, reigned in his place of his father, Josiah. Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. If I remember correctly, I think this is Jeremiah from the prophet Jeremiah, just a heads up. Not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure. Anyways, in 32, and he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his fathers had done. And Pharaoh Necho put him in bands at Riblah, in the land of Hamath, that he might not reign in Jerusalem, and put the land to a tribute of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. And Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, the son of Josiah, that I'm glad we had that come in, the son of Josiah, king in the room of Josiah his father, and turned his name to Jehoiakim, and took Jehoahaz, and he came to Egypt, and he died there. And Jehoiakim gave the silver and the gold to Pharaoh, but he taxed the land to give the money according to the commandment of Pharaoh. He exacted the silver and the gold of the people of the land, and everyone according to his taxation, to give it to Pharaoh Necho. All right, so we're still going into detail somewhat of Josiah's time. And I said it wrong. It wasn't Jehoahaz that reigned in place of Josiah. It was Eliakim. Jehoahaz, if I remember correctly, was over Jerusalem or Judah. But anyways, so he was 23 years old when he became king over Judah, if I remember correctly. But it points out that he did all evil in the sight of the Lord, everything that his fathers have done. So again, we have the same continuation of people doing more evil and not deciding to change, not deciding to do what's right. But then it went to point out that Pharaoh Necho, who, as we read from the last part, it went to point out that he died from Josiah killing him. But at this time, we're going back in time as kind of like a flashback in a movie of a situation that took place when Josiah was alive. And Pharaoh Necho, he put him in bands. In other words, he bound him up in Riblah. So we have where Jehoahaz was bound up by Pharaoh in Riblah. And where it says that he might not reign in Jerusalem. So we have that confirmation that he was the king of Jerusalem. Now, here's the thing, something to keep in mind when you're reading. Remember, whenever we see the word that as a starting point for a verse section or a little section to read, like here, where it says that he might not reign in Jerusalem, what you could switch the word that with to get the understanding in our day and age is to say, for the purpose of, or for the purpose. So really how this would be read in our day and age is that Pharaoh bound up Jehoahaz over in Riblah, which was in the land of Hamath, for the purpose so that he wouldn't reign in Jerusalem. Exactly, Chris, when I say so that. But you guys got confused of it, so I'm making it more simple. You could say for the purpose of. For the purpose of that, for the purpose so that he wouldn't reign in Jerusalem. So he's trying to keep Jehoahaz from being king over Jerusalem. And but not only that, he put the land of Jerusalem, and we know it's Jerusalem in the context because it brings up about him not reigning in Jerusalem. So we're talking about that same city. And he put that land to tribute, which means they had to pay up or work off a debt, whether it's a tribute of slavery or a tribute of money. It's an offering. So it's an offering of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. Now, this is where you want to be cautious when you're reading to make sure you catch what it's saying. Because when it said he put the land to tribute, that doesn't mean that this is going to be a regular offering. It only means that it happened that one total. Now, it could be that that total was going to be in repetition, but we don't have that information as of yet. So we need to make sure we say it based on the level of information we have. We don't know if it's going to be continuous, but we do know that he at least made that land, that Pharaoh made that land in order to give 100 talents of silver and 1 talent of gold. And then it went on to explain that Pharaoh, he made Eliakim, the son of Josiah, king in the room of Josiah's father, meaning that Pharaoh made Eliakim to be king over Israel, which Josiah was king of. And then when it said, and turned his name to Jehoiakim. Now, when it says turned his name, that could be confusing if you don't understand where turned means. If it said turned him to Jehoiakim, that would mean that it faced Eliakim, that he started facing Jehoiakim. He started going to Jehoiakim, whether for counseling, understanding, or maybe as an enemy. But it said he turned him. That would be what it would have to say. But because it said he turned his name, we know that it's the name that's turning, not Eliakim. So, in other words, what that means simply is that the Pharaoh changed the name of Eliakim to Jehoiakim, and he took Jehoahaz away and came to Egypt and died there. So when Pharaoh took Jehoahaz away, he took Jehoahaz to Egypt, and Jehoahaz died. But Jehoiakim, which is the new name for Eliakim, he gave the silver and the gold to Pharaoh. But when we see here, but he taxed the land to give money according to the commandment of Pharaoh. Now we got to be cautious, because yes, it's bringing up the commandment of Pharaoh and it's bringing up the taxes. But it didn't say that, but he taxed the land. It said he taxed the land according to the commandment of Pharaoh. So that means we're not talking about Pharaoh taxing. We're actually talking about Jehoiakim doing the taxing. So Jehoiakim is taxing the land in order to give the money that Pharaoh commanded. And as I said, he exacted the silver. So he got the exact amount of the silver and the gold of the people of the land, everyone according to his taxation, to give it to Pharaoh. So we got Jehoiakim basically working in lockstep for Pharaoh. Now, we don't know if this is necessarily an evil thing, because at the time, all we have is that the taxes are being paid, but they're under the control of Pharaoh at the moment. So it is possible that this is showing signs of evil, but it's also possible that they're just paying their dues. It'll depend on whether or not we see something else coming up. Now then, does anybody have any questions as I go to the second section, or comments they would like to say? Now would be the time. All right. Then 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 36 to chapter 24, verse 4. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. Okay, so we got a little confirmation. It wasn't over Israel that Eliakim became king. It was over Jerusalem in place of Jehoahaz. So he put him in there instead. So Jehoahaz was trying to be king over the area of Josiah, and it wasn't Israel. I was wrong about that. It was Jerusalem. So we have the confirmation here. But anyways, Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he began to reign. And he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Zebudah, the daughter of Pedaiah of Rumah. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. Oh, we got a confirmation there. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his fathers had done. In the days of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him. And the Lord sent against him bands of the Chaldees, and bands of the Syrians, and bands of the Moabites, and bands of the children of Ammon, and sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord, which he spake by his servants, the prophets. Surely the commandment of the Lord came this upon Judah, to remove them out of the sight of the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he did. Now, we got some interesting points to point out here. One, we have confirmation that while Jehoiakim was trying to do the bidding of Pharaoh, we know now that it's definitely not because he's just trying to pay his dues. and stay out of trouble, but actually that he's siding with Pharaoh and basically being on Pharaoh's side instead of God's. So what ends up happening? What do we see? Again, we see where he did evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all his fathers done. So yet another king who isn't putting God first, but rather his own selfishness, whether it's survival or whether it's advancement or whether it's positivity. But then when we get to 24, now this brings up a very important point. Nebuchadnezzar, that name has come up in our worship services before. And the reason that that has come up is that the prophet Daniel wrote about the situation where Nebuchadnezzar was trying to get all of Israel to worship his false god, and they would be thrown in a furnace to be put to death. But there were three people, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three refused to bow down to the false god. So they were thrown in the furnace. And when they were thrown in the furnace, Nebuchadnezzar was amazed because when he looked in and saw it, he saw that not only were those three perfectly fine, but there was a fourth one. And that fourth one he described as it looked as the Son of God. So this is the time frame, 2 Kings, as the same time frame as Daniel, as one of the examples where Jesus himself was in the Old Testament. And this is why we go in so much into that point. In order to deny Christ, you have to ignore the entire Bible. We've seen evidence of Christ in Genesis, in Exodus, all the 5 books of Moses. And then here we have the time frame where the book of Daniel comes in. So even in 2 Kings, it is a direct correlation showing Jesus being in the Old Testament, not just in the New. Now, here in 24 verse 2, this is where we had to be cautious about definitions. So we just talked about somebody having bands around them, and we talked about it in the last section. One of them was talking about having somebody basically detained. But here we have where it's actually talking about groups of people, more like troops of an army. So yeah, troops of the army of the Chaldees, yeah, troops of the army of the Syrians, the Moabites, and it just went down the list. And all of them came against Judah to destroy it, as it brought up according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by his servants, the prophets. Well, we had the servants of the prophets before. One of them was a prophetess, a female prophet. And we had the other prophets that spoke on this too. So here we have where God's actually fulfilling what he said after he had told Josiah that Josiah would be able to die in peace because he was so faithful to God. But here we have where it's starting to take place. All the evil that he had spoken through Hezekiah because of the evils of Manasseh and what was going on. So in verse 23, we have the quote from them where it brings up, as we're starting to read basically what the prophets had said. Or not the prophets necessarily. That's one possibility. Let me rephrase that. It could just be the people at the time, not necessarily for the prophets, but we'll see. So in verse 3, we have where it points out, surely at the commandment of the Lord came this upon Judah, to remove them out of his sight from the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he did. So we have where they're pointing out that all this evil that's happening, everything that's going wrong, it's all because of the evils that Manasseh did. Now it's just finally happening. Now, this goes into an interesting point and a lesson for us to take in our own lives. Maybe your life is going great. Maybe things are working out. But maybe it's not. Maybe you're having a bunch of problems. Ironically, that this verse will come up after everything that's happened the last week. When things ain't working out, when they're not going right, maybe it's because you're not doing the things you're supposed to do. Maybe you're not showing your side of putting God first. And the thing is, you could put God first in 70% of your ideas and the things that you do. Maybe you're on Bible study. Maybe you're praying. But if you're not putting God first 100%, what did we notice? Every time somebody put God first halfway, and never worked out. So we're seeing that happen here where even though it took some time, the punishment came. Now it brings into a massive point because of the situation of Manasseh. Before Manasseh, there was a faithful king. And after Manasseh with Josiah, Josiah was the most faithful we have heard of all the kings of Israel so far. So when we look into it from that situation, it goes to show that if you, even if you are trying to do right somewhat, but if everything is going good for you while you're sitting there doing right by God, if you elect or choose to stop doing good, the punishment may not come right away. But trust and believe that the punishment is going to come. Just like this didn't happen during the time of Manasseh because Josiah was faithful. So it happened after Josiah when Manasseh's already gone. But the punishment still took place. So don't assume if everything's going good at the moment that you could let up and stop doing everything for God. Because you might be putting your own children or your children's children into terms of punishment for what you do. Because when the time was up and you could do right by God, and especially with the fact that He had been blessing you, you let up on how much effort you were doing. You let up on how much focus you were giving to the things of God, whether for fear, whether for blessing, whether for excitement. The reason doesn't matter because the bottom line is either God is first or God is last. There is no in between. Now then, does anybody have any comments or questions as we go to the final section? Now would be the time to raise your hand if you do. All right. Now, chapter 20. Let me say it right. 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 4 through 7. And also for the innocent blood that he shed, for he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, which the Lord would not pardon. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? So Jehoiakim slept with his fathers. And Jehoiachin, wait, let me make sure that that's accurate. Oh, it's pretty much the same name. The only difference is Jehoiakim versus Jehoiakim. So Jehoiakim versus Jehoiakim. Keen and Kim. The M and the N. That's the only difference. So, anyways, and Jehoiakim, his son, reigned in his stead. Now we got the new king. And the king of Egypt came not again any more out of this land. For the king of Babylon had taken from the river of Egypt unto the river Euphrates all that pertained to the king of Egypt. Now, as we said at this was sort of a flashback, because remember, at Josiah's lifetime, we had where that Pharaoh, Necho, where he had been killed by Josiah. He got stabbed, but he got carried back. So this happened while Josiah was still alive, this whole flashback, the situation. So when we're going through this and all the innocent blood, now remember, we kept on reading it multiple times where the innocent blood, where they were burning their sons and daughters on the altar of a false god in a form of worship during Manasseh's time and as well. So all that innocent blood that got killed. And it's a good thing as we look at it, the Lord would not pardon him. See, we talk a lot about the blessing and forgiveness that God has. And we have an example where someone who had set people up to kill, Paul, where he was pardoned. But notice the difference between how Paul was pardoned and here this man Jehoiakim was not. Jehoiakim killed innocent blood, and there was no repentance or anything. With Paul, we're talking about a sinful generation. And on top of that, Paul repented. Paul was doing it without knowledge. He didn't know what he was doing. Whereas here, Manasseh and Jehoiakim, they knew exactly what was going on, but they did anyways. And then it went to point out that at that flashback type time frame, that the king of Egypt, Pharaoh Necho, he didn't come back anymore out of his land. But it brings up why that the king, so we had Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, he had overtaken or taken over all the way from the river of Egypt all the way to the river Euphrates, the same area that the king of Egypt had taken over before. Now it's been taken over by somebody else, the king of Babylon. Now, interesting side note off of that. So now, does anybody have any comments or any questions as we go before we pray it out? All right, then I'll go ahead and pray us out. Father, thank you for this time that you've given us to be able to hear your word. And I'm grateful that we can at least be able to listen in, to be able to understand what's being read, what's being heard. And I just pray as we go forward that we can get to an opportunity and a point where not only in time frame, but a mentality that we can reach out to others and gain more followers, as well as we be faithful followers ourselves. Because it's not a game. This is not something we can just go about our everyday life and treat like it doesn't matter. This is eternal salvation or it's eternal damnation. And God, I pray because of that, just as we see with Jehoiakim and just as we see in Manasseh and compare it to Josiah, I pray that everybody that is gone right now, I pray that they have something in their life. I don't care if it's positive or turmoil that would waken up their eyes to the truth. And even though they can't be back now, that they would question where they are. And I pray for those that are here that they remain faithful, that nobody else be false. But if anybody should come in that is false, I pray that they leave quickly, that only faithful Christians remain here longer than a month. And those that are faithful, that they stay for a lifetime. And that fruit would bear, that we would have masses of Christians, faithful ones, enough to have that Christian city that I've dreamed of so much. So God, I pray you have your way in it. And I also ask for forgiveness for the sins of everybody that's been on here that has sinned, myself and others. In your son's holy and precious name, Jesus Christ Yeshua. Amen.